Welcome to another Wisdom Pod. We have Richard Day with us. He's a potentialist and executive leadership coach, a high performance coach that worked with a bunch of top athletes before, facilitator, and a speaker and an author of Unification. That is, can find more about him at richardday.com. This podcast is brought to you by my podcasting company. If you want to start your podcast, if you want to scale podcast, you can do that at podpire.com. Richard, welcome to the pods. Tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Yeah, hi, Charles. Thank you for the opportunity to interact with your audience. So, yeah, I've always had a background and an interest in high performance and the potential of individuals. And that initially started as a degree in exercise physiology and then working with athletes and sports teams to be their high performance coach. And over time, that was fascinating. And it also, when you work with athletes at that caliber, they're very single-minded focused, which is enjoyable. And at the same time, after about 10 years, I decided I wanted to move some of the focus and some of the stuff that I'd been doing with the athletes into the corporate space. And at the time, the corporate space was actually not particularly well versed in wellness, performance strategies, nutrition, work-life integration strategies, those sorts of things. And so basically, I then went back and did some more study, some postgrad study in coaching, leadership, and organizational coaching. And now I play in the space of working with individuals and businesses. It's mostly small to medium size because they're more agile than large businesses. And I work with them to identify what strategies they could be doing differently and better that would make an impact both on themselves and their bottom line.
Fascinating. Working with top athletes, what challenges, mindset wise, did you find into them and how did you help them break through the other side?
Yeah, look, I think probably the most prevalent mindset when I was involved was sometimes the issue of ego and how much, I mean, I guess there's a double side to that. Some of them had egos that were really big, and at the same time, those egos were one of the reasons why they were so good at what they did. I think, though, when you get involved in team dynamics and team sports, you start to recognize that elite athletes also have to be able to rein in their egos so that they can interface with teams more effectively. And I do a lot of team coaching, not in the elite athlete space, but in the corporate space. And that's also a similar issue in the corporate area as well. Sometimes leaders who have got really high egos can sometimes fracture and disengage people in teams.
Right. So, what's the right equilibrium? Me, the most poignant analogies I always use for ego is like rappers in the US, like 50 Cent, for example. Sometimes they can take their ego too far because the ego, it does help. And I would encourage people to have a little bit more ego, generally speaking, because people are anxious about pretty much everything nowadays and they're doubting themselves. There's a lot of imposter syndrome. But once you have that ego, you can have a bit too much of it. It's cool to start believing your own ideas and visions, but sometimes you can be kidding yourself. You can be selling something to yourself that is not true to your values. You can start lying to yourself, convincing that taking this deal is a good thing for you while it's not. And then it's the auto sabotage comes. So, what's the right equilibrium between ego and heart, I guess?
It's a good point, and you've raised something that I think is really fundamental to all high performers, and that's the ability, Charles, to be able to establish and clarify two things. First of all, what their purpose is in life and business, and what are their defining values. And if you can land, or when you land on a clear purpose and really clear values, then you have a navigational system internally that allows you to make the right decisions about, am I doing the right work? Is this the right person for me to be partnering with, in whatever sense that might be? And that's something a lot of people don't, I think a lot of people don't really know. So if I was to walk down the street in any civilized country and just ask someone randomly, what's your purpose in life and what are your top 3 values, I suspect I would struggle to get an answer from them that would be clear and definitive. And then what that makes me think is, well, if you don't know what you stand for and where you're going, then no wonder everyone seems to be quite confused about who they are and what they're about. So if you get that part right, then your ego starts to become a little bit less of a problem because you have some clear direction about yourself.
So I started a decade ago having the very broad vision of make humanity a better place or something like that. It was a beautiful vision, but I felt that on my day to day, I wouldn't make the needle move forward on that one. I mean, it's quite broad. So nowadays I go a bit more ikigai when it comes to my mission, my vision, namely that I try to come up with something just like I tried to come up with a great business idea, right? I tried to go with product market fit with my philosophy. So it's not only about me, it's also about the market. And I found that my best crusade nowadays was converting as many people into entrepreneurs because I believe that, yeah, entrepreneurship does a lot of good. I believe it's not that controversial, although I might offend people saying that 9 to 5ers do not add much value. And I think I can get a lot of people behind me. Plus, I can make money while doing it. So, what do you have to say about finding your purpose and your ultimate vision?
I like your logic. I think that as I reflect on what you've just said to me, I think that you can still keep your original purpose because the purpose you currently have feeds into that anyway. I think one of the things that's worthwhile noting for people if they're interested in creating a purpose is that it should have 3 very clear components to it. The first one is it should be inspirational for that person. The second one is that it should be aspirational, meaning that they'll probably never, ever completely fulfill it. And the third one is, which is interesting because you touched on it, it has to have a benefit to humanity. Now, the thing, it's just to be clear on that, I'm not actually saying that it has to support a charity per se, but what it should do is it should inspire humanity and improve humanity by the execution of the purpose. So to give you an idea, my purpose is to co-create inspiration and empowerment. So technically speaking, you could argue, well, how do you do that every day? Well, that gets down to how I choose to interface with people. It's certainly a compass for me to decide whether I should be involved in something. So the reason you and I are talking is because I found that your entrepreneurial podcast and the fact that you reached out actually aligned with co-creating inspiration and empowerment. So when I come across activities, ideas, thoughts, and concepts that actually align with that, that's the first base for me. And once I get to first base, well, then, of course, it's just about extending that concept. I think you can actually be inspirational, empowering, every day, irrespective of what you do. It's about how you treat other people. It's about how you treat your clients, your customers, the concepts that you constantly demonstrate to them that make them realize how authentic you are.
There's just one problem I feel with like my mission and vision of, or like let's call it the vision of, yeah, creating as many founders as possible. It's the money. It's not the most um, lucrative things compared to other stuff that I'm doing. So I'm not sure if I should put it on my LinkedIn. Basically, I think that the lead gen thing is much more attractive in terms of ROI. But yeah, I'll see what I can do with that. You got me thinking. What's a potentialist, and how do you make sure to truly embody the potentialist on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question. I'll answer your first one, the first question. So I came up with the title potentialist, Charles, just because I'm a little bit of an entrepreneur. I like to think I am, and so I'm not bound by convention so much. And I thought, well, if you can have a futurist, somebody who actually deals in concepts of what the future may hold, why couldn't you have a potentialist? So basically, when I reflected on the work that I do, really it was actually about releasing and identifying potential in people so they could act on it. So that's where that came from. In relation to the second question, can you repeat the second question for me, Charles, again?
Yeah,
Sorry.
how do you embody the potentialist on a
Ah,
daily basis? How do you make sure to be 1% better on a daily basis, which is my obsession?
yeah, it's cool. It's a good obsession. I'm pleased that you have it. I wish more people did. I think one of the things is first of all to recognize that we are human, meaning that some days we may not in fact feel or be as be the role model we hope to be. But I think the critical piece there is that's being human. It's about recognizing that that's what happens. We do undulate. We do have a variation in our performance mentality and our energy. But I think in that lies the other part of the solution, and that is to constantly evolve and look at your habits and your rituals and your behaviors and decide which one of which of these behaviors, for example, are embodying my purpose. And to give you a practical example, I became aware recently of how frequently people frame things negatively. So an example would be, don't forget to do this. And, the potentialist in me just goes, well, hang on, there's a much more powerful way to say that. And that's simply, please remember what I asked you to do. And if you think about the wording of both those statements, it's a subtle difference, but it's actually a very powerful message you're giving to yourself. And as you probably know, if someone says to you, don't forget, it actually forces the brain to actually think about that undesirable behavior and then go, no, don't do that. But it's a much more powerful pathway simply just to say, Charles, can you please remember to do this? So in those little nuanced spaces, there are always opportunities. I mean, another example is I'm very, the environment's very important to me, and I don't like litter. And so when I go out walking with, my dog and my partner, I'll spend some part of that walk picking up litter that I come across. Now, my partner gets a bit annoyed by it, but that's okay. I don't do it every time. But basically, it's funny because, people will actually see me doing it and they'll say things like, that's really inspiring. Thank you for doing that. And I don't do it for that reason, but I guess it's a simple example of how being more aware of what you say and what behaviors you demonstrate, you can gently refine your behavior so that you become a better version of yourself every day.
I like that. Especially if you've got the system to counter the bacterias and not dirty yourself too much. But yeah, I think society needs people like you, like me. I go out every day in the mountain. I run. I don't see a lot of litter, fortunately, in the mountain. But yeah, I'm just
But
busy
that's
running
good.
and doing my thing, right? Like I'm pretty
Yeah, sure.
selfish in that regards. But yeah, right now you probably planted a seed in me, and now my systematic self is like, oh, I'm gonna buy a thing to, stab these things on Amazon, some bag to put it inside, and yeah, probably gonna burn myself under the sun for a couple of hours picking up trash in a nearby weekend. So yeah,
Now
great.
look, that's cool, Charles. But I reckon there's something you just said which is interesting, and I'd like to just discuss it if I can, because you just said you do some stuff for yourself, which I think you used the word selfish, and I'm going to actually raise that concept with you, or raise another component of it, and I'm going to say to you, have you ever heard of the line or the philosophy of it's important to be selfish to become selfless?
Right. Yeah, your own oxygen mask basically before the other.
Correct. So when you say I'm out doing my run, to me, that's a ritual that's in fact important for you to be able to be a physically healthy or physically healthier version of yourself. So, when I talk about rituals, I think every high performer and someone who's maximizing their potential becomes really aware of the behaviors that they have every day and which ones support and which ones don't. So I actually, funnily enough, I actually wish people were more selfish with what they need to have for themselves before they actually go out and look after others. But I want to be clear, we're not talking here about material stuff. We're talking about being selfish for getting enough sleep, being selfish to be able to include activity in your day, being selfish enough to spend, money on good food, being selfish enough to meditate and
Vacations,
time. Yeah, all that
experiences.
stuff. Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very good point. Again, I think that we live in an age in which people are like shell shocked. It seems that they don't have a direction. Um they just fall under what's already there. They follow the news, they scroll on
Yeah.
Instagram, and yeah, they don't stop. Also, like what do you have to say about like stopping, taking some time for recovery, thinking? I'm guilty of that too.
Oh, I think that's a massive point, Charles. I would say to you that the solution to the dilemma you've just presented is people learning to become more self-aware and learning to tune into their emotions so they can start to track levels of dissatisfaction and attach them to behaviors, activities, or thoughts. So when a person sits down and self-reflects, it might be, how do I think this discussion went, right? And generally, I will, at the end of any activity, I'll take a moment. I could have a coffee, or I could go for a walk, or I could sit down and just reflect on what I think I did well in the experience. And I think one of the things we can do better as a society is actually celebrate the stuff we do well before we look at what we could do better. And most leaders that I work with suffer from this isolation syndrome, where people will not give them positive feedback even though they think they're doing a good job, because of all the associated psychological baggage that comes with that, right? I'm sucking up to the boss. He mightn't like what I say, or she mightn't like what I say. And I really get people to start getting a little more in touch with, if they feel like they should say something, either a compliment or something to help someone become more effective and more powerful as an individual, then they should, because otherwise nobody knows, right?
Right. I have a problem with like NDAs at corporations and, censoring uh freedom of speech, sort of, hey, you can't say that. Oh, I can't talk about that. I mean, sometimes it does have value, right? Like say a competitor is gonna steal it, or I don't know, it's like a defense secret, and bad people are gonna take this technology into their hands. But most of the time it's just like scaring people and putting them in that anxiety state pretty much all the time.
Mm.
And that's one reason why I'm fighting for entrepreneurship, because there's no NDAs. And well, I mean, what you have with your clients sometimes, but I'm a big believer in freedom of speech and saying what you think and getting feedback. Think that people are quite separated nowadays, also in their opinions. They think that someone with a different opinion than theirs is an enemy,
Yeah.
someone that needs to be destroyed instead of having a convo with them. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to our first point, Charles, around the role of ego. So I think I can reflect on that, and unfortunately I can remember times when, if I was involved in a conversation, it was very important for a person to be able to understand and agree to my point of view. And when I reflected on that, as I do with a lot of things in my own life, I realized that that was really unreasonable, and that was really my ego at play. So the first part around what you've just said is, of course, when we have to have people who are prepared to have dialogue through with the express intention of learning and growing as a result, as opposed to winning the argument. And I couldn't agree with you more. And in relation to the I guess, organizations or societies or political parties or governments to clamp down on free speech. I think that's a really dangerous thing for all sorts of reasons. I think one of the things that's important is that we give people the opportunity to speak freely about things, and we move away from this ridiculous mentality that, what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is always fake news. So I think when you actually sit down and you do a podcast like this, it's a very pure way of an audience seeing two people converse and share ideas and concepts, and then hopefully take something for themselves that they might use.
Right. Last but not least, Richard, what are your top three goals for this year?
My top three goals for this year, okay, is to master, to practice my bass guitar at least an hour to 2 hours every week. The second one is to continually update my book because it's in its third edition now. And so one of the things I like to do is read broadly and come across information and concepts that I want to include in the next edition. And the third thing would be to maintain a really cool work-life integration / balance that I've had for the last 10, 15 years.
And where can people find out more about you, Richard?
To just simply go to richardday.com.au.